Hi, everybody. Welcome to this week's topic about ancient India literature and Chinese literature. Indian literature, writings of the Indian subcontinent produced there a variety of vernacular languages, including Sanskrit, Prakrit, Pali, Bengali, Bahani, Drathani, Hindi, Kannada, Kashmiri, Malayalam, Oriya, Punjabi, Rajasthani, Tamil, Telugu, Urdu, Alahanda, Saraiki, and Sindhi, as well as in English. The term Indian literature is used here to refer to literature produced across the Indian subcontinent prior to the creation of the Republic of India. In 1947 and within the Republic of India after 1947. A brief treatment of Indian literature follows for further treatment. We can see the South Asian arts and literature, and also Islamic arts. Islamic literatures, India, the arts, Pakistan, the arts, and Bangladesh, the arts. The earliest Indian literature took the form of canonical Hindu sacred writings known as Veda, which is written in Sanskrit. To the Veda were added prose commentaries such as the Brahmas and the Upanishads, and the production of the Samarahat literature extended from about 1500 BCE to about 10,000 CE and reached the height of development in the first 7 centuries of CE. In addition to sacred and philosophical writings such as genres as erotic and devotional lyrics, court poetry, plays, and narrative folktales emerged. Because Sanskrit was identified with the Brahmanical religion in Vedas, Buddhism and Jainism adopted other literary literatures like Pali and Ardamali, respectively. From these and other related languages emerged the modern languages of northern India. The literature of those languages suspended largely in the ancient Indian background, which includes 2 Sanskrit epic poems, the Mahabharata and Ramayana, as well as the Bhagavad Purana and the other Puranas. In addition, the Sanskrit philosophies were a source of philosophical writing in the later literatures, and the Sanskrit schools of rhetoric were of great importance for the development of court poetry and many of the modern literatures. The South Indian language of Tamil is an exception to the pattern of the Sanskrit influences because it had a classical tradition of its own. Urdu and Sindhi are other expectations. Beginning in the 19th century, particularly during the height of British control over the subcontinent, Western literary models had an impact on Indian literature. The most striking result being an introduction of the use of vernacular prose on the major scale. Such forms as novel and short story began to be adopted by Indian writers, as did relativism and the interest in social questions and psychological description. A tradition of literature in English was also established in the subcontinent. Articles on individual literatures of Indian subcontinent are not specified above include Pali literature, Bengali literature, Gujarati literature, Hindi literature, Kannada literature, Punjabi literature, Tamil literature, Telugu literature, Urdu literature, and Sindhi literature. We have Chinese literature. Chinese literature is a form of works in Chinese, including lyric, poetry, historical, dialectic, writing, drama, and various forms of fiction. Chinese literature is one of the major literary heritages in the world with the uninterrupted history of more than 3,000 years dating back to the 14th century BCE. Its medium, the Chinese language, is retained. Its unmistakable identity in both its spoken and written aspects of, despite generally gradual changes in pronunciation, the existence of regional and local dialects, and several stages in the structural representation, written graphs, characters. Even the partial or total conquest of China is considerable periods of non-Han Chinese ethnic groups from outside the Great Wall failed to disrupt its continuity, and the conquerors were forced to adopt the written Chinese language as their official medium of communication where they had none of their own. Since Chinese graphs were inherently non-phonetic, they were at best unsatisfactory tools for the transcription of non-Chinese language and attempts at creating a new alphabetic phonemic written language for the empire's building proved unsuccessful on 3 separate occasions. The result was that after a period of alien domination, the conquerors were culturally assimilated except for the Mongols, who retreated en masse to their original homeland after the collapse in the Yuan or the Mongol dynasty in 1368. Thus, there is no disruption in the Chinese literary development. General characteristics. Through cultural context, Chinese literature was profoundly influenced by the literary traditions of other Asian countries, particularly in Korea, Japan, and Vietnam. Not only was the Chinese script adopted for written language in other countries, but some writers adopted the Chinese language as their chief literary medium, at least before the 20th century. The graphic nature of the written aspect of Chinese language has produced a number of noteworthy effects upon the Chinese literature and the diffusion. Chinese literature, especially poetry, is recorded in handwriting or print, and purports of make an aesthetic appeal to the reader as visual as aerial. This visual appeal to the graphics has in fact given rise to the elevated status of calligraphy in China, where it's been regarded for at least the last 16 centuries as fine art comparable to writing. Scrolls of calligraphic renderings of poems and prose selections have continued to be hung alongside the paintings in the homes of the common people as well as the elite, converting these literary gems into something to be enjoyed in everyday living. On the negative side, such a writing system has been an impediment to education and spread of literacy, thus reducing the number of readers of knowledge. For even rudimentary level of reading and writing requires knowledge of more than 1,000 graphs together with the pronunciation. On the other hand, Chinese written language, even with obvious advantages or disadvantages, has been a prominent factor in penetrating cultural unity of the growing millions of Chinese people, including assimilated groups in the far-flung perceptual areas, different in function from recording words in the alphabetic phonemic language. The graphs are not primarily indicators of sound, can therefore be pronounced in a variant ways to accommodate geographical diversities in speech and historical phonological changes without damage to the meaning of the written page. As a result, the major dialects in China never developed into separate written languages, as did Romance languages. Another reader of the Confucian classic in southern China might not understand the everyday speech of people from the far north. Chinese literature has continued to be the most common asset of the whole Han Chinese people. By the same token, the graphs of China could be utilized by speakers of other languages as literary mediums. The pronunciation of Chinese graphs has also influenced the development of Chinese literature. The fact that each graph had a phonemic pronunciation in a given context created a large number of homonyms, which led to misunderstanding and confusion when spoken or read aloud with the aid of the graphs. One corrective was the introduction of tones or pitches in pronunciation. As a result, meter in the Chinese prosody is not considered with the combination of syllabic stresses as in English, but with those syllabic tones which produce a different but equally pleasing cadence. The tonal feature of the Chinese language has brought about intimate relationship between poetry and music in China. All major types of Chinese poetry were originally sung to accompany music. Even after the musical scores were lost, the poems were, as they still are, more often chanted in order of approximate singing than merely read. Chinese poetry, besides depending on the end rhyme and the tonal meter for the cadence, is characterized by compactness and brevity. There are no epics of either folk or literary variety, and hardly any narrative or descriptive poems that are long by the standards of the world literature. Stressing the lyrical has often been pointed out, the Chinese poet refrains from being exhaustive, marking instead of the heights of aesthesis and inspiration of the depths of sorrow and sympathy. Generally, pronouns and conjunctions are omitted, and one or two words are often allude to highly complex thoughts and situations. This explains why many poems have been differently interrupted by learned commenters and competent translators. So we do know that sometimes when we change words from one language to the next, sometimes the meaning might change a little bit. And sometimes the author may have said something, but it doesn't get quite translated that same way in the next language. The line of demarcation between prose and poetry is much less distinctly drawn in the Chinese literature than any other national literatures. This is clearly reflected in the three genres. The Fu, for example, is the borderline between poetry and prose, containing elements of both. It uses rhyme and meter and not infrequently also an aesthetic structure, but despite occasional flights into the realm of the poetic, it retains the features of prose without being necessarily prosodic. This accounts for the variety of labels given to the Fu in English by writers of Chinese literature: poetic prose, rhyme prose, prose poem, rhapsody, and prose poetry. Another genre belonging to this category is panwen, a parallel prose, characterized by an aesthetic construction and balanced tonal patterns without the use of rhyme. The term is suggestive in the team of paired horses as implied in the Chinese word pian. Despite the polyphonic effect thus produced, which approximates that of the poetry, it's often been made in the vehicle of prose-like exposition and argumentation. Another genre, a particular mutation in this borderland, is Mbagawin, eight-legged essay, now generally regarded as unworthy of classification as a literature for centuries. From 1487 to 1901, it was dominated by the field of Chinese writing as a principal yardstick in grading candidates' official civil service examinations. It exploited antithetical construction and contrasting tonal patterns in the limit by requiring pairs of columns consisting of the long paragraphs, one responding to the other word by word, phrase by phrase, sentence for sentence. Chinese prose writing has been diverted into two streams, separated at least for the last 1,000 years by a gap much wider than one between the folk songs and the so-called literary poems. Classical literary prose, Guwen and Wenyan, aims at the substandards and styles set by ancient writers and their distinguished followers of subsequent ages, with the Confucian classics and early philosophers as supreme models. While the styles may vary with individual writers. The language is always far removed from their spoken tongues. Sanctioned by official requirements for competitive examinations and dignified by traditional respect for the cultural accomplishment of the past ages, this medium became a linguistic tool of practicality. All Chinese prose, writers' vernacular prose, Baliha, in contrast, consistent writing in the living medium was previously avoided for creative writing until it was adopted by novelists and playwrights in the 13th century on. Origins 1400 to 22 BCE. The oldest specimens of Chinese writing, extant or inscriptions on the bones and tortoise shells, dating back to the last 3 centuries of the Shang dynasty in 18th to 12th century BCE, and recording divinations performed at the royal capital. These inscriptions, like those engraved on ceremonial bronze vessels toward the end of the Shang period, are usually brief and factual and cannot be considered literature. Nevertheless, they are significant in their sizable vocabulary. The 3,400 characters, which is nearly 2,000, have been reliably depicted, has proved to be direct ancestor of modern Chinese script. Moreover, the centennial structure of the language bears a striking resemblance to later usages, from the frequent occurrences to the bone inscriptions, such as characters of dance and music and drum and times of stone, words and southern airs, can be safely inherited by the Shang dynasty. Songs were sung to the accomplishment of dance and music, and these songs are now lost. Literary use of myths. Early Chinese literature does not present, as the literatures of certain other world cultures do, great epics embodied in mythological lore. What information exists is sketchy and fragmentary, provides no clear evidence that an organic mythology ever existed. If it did, all traces have been lost. Attempts by scholars, Eastern and Western alike, to reconstruct the mythology of antiquity have consequently not advanced beyond probable thesis. Shang dynasty material is limited. Zhou dynasty 1046 to 256 BC. Sources are plentiful, but these must at times be supplemented by writings of Han dynasty 206 BCE to 220 CE, which however must be read with great caution. This is the case because Han scholars reworked the ancient text to such an extent that no one is quite sure, aside from evident forgeries, how much was deliberately reinterpreted and how much was changed in good faith from attempt to clarity ambiguities to reconcile considerations. The early state of Chinese mythologies were also modeled by religious situation that prevailed in China, at least since the Zhou conquest, 11th century BCE, when religious observance connected to the cult of dominant deities was proclaimed a royal preconventive. Because of temporal position, the king alone was considered qualified to offer sacrifice and to pray in these deities. Shangdi, supreme ruler, for example, one of the prime dispensers of change in fate, was inaccessible to the persons of lower rank. The princes, the aristocracy, and the commoners were thus compelled in descending order to worship lesser gods and ancestors. The situation was greatly modified about the time of Confucius in the early part of the 5th century BCE. Institutional inheritance and the tend toward rationalism precluded to the revival of the mythological world. Confucius prayed to heaven, Tan, and was concerned about the great sacrifices, but he and his school had little use for genuine myths. Nevertheless, during the later centuries, Zhou Chinese mythology began to undergo a profound transformation. The old gods, to great extent already forgotten, were gradually supplemented by a multitude of new ones, some of which were imported from India with Buddhism or gained popular acceptance as Taoism spread throughout the empire. In the process, many early myths were totally reinterpreted to the extent that some deities and mythological figures were rationalized into abstract concepts and others were euphemized into historical figures. Above all, a heretical order, resembling in many ways the institutional order of the empire, was imposed upon the world of the supernatural. Many of the Socratic myths were lost, others survived only fragments, and in effect, the entire new mythological world was created. These new gods generally had defined functions and definite personal characteristics and became prominent in literature and other arts. The myth of the battles between Handim, the Yellow Emperor, and Chiyu, the wormy transgressor, for example, became part of the Taoist lore and eventually provided models for chapters of two works in the vernacular fiction. Zohan, the water margin, also translated as All Men Are Brothers, and Zenchi, the Journey of the West, also particularly translated as Monkey. Other mythological features like Kung Fu and Shaoman subsequently provided motifs for numerous poems and stories. Historic personages were commonly taken into the pantheon, for Chinese popular imagination has been quick to endow the biology of a beloved hero with legendary and eventually mythological traits. The Qiuyan, the ill-fated minister of the state of Chao, 2771 to 221 BCE, is the most notable example. Myth-making consequently became a constant living process in China. It was also true that historical heroes and would-be heroes arranged their biographies in a way that lent themselves mythologizing. Poetry. The first anthology of Chinese poetry known is Xingyujing, the classic of poetry, and consisting of temple, court, and folk songs, was given definite forms wherein around the time of Confucius, 551 to 479 BCE, but its 305 songs are believed to range in the date of beginning Zhou dynasty to the time of their compiling. The Sheng is generally accounted for a third of the five classes, Wanying and Confucian literature, the other for our Zhijing, the classic of changes, and the book of divination, cosmology, and the Shaoying, the classic of history, a collection of official documents, the Liji, the record of the rites, a book of rituals, accompanying anecdotes, and the Qinghu, the spring and autumn annuals, and a classical history of the feudal state of Lu, where Confucius was born, consisting of topical entries of major events from 722 to 481 BCE. The five classics has been held in high esteem by Chinese scholars since the 2nd century BCE for discussion of Ying and Zhua. And the poems of Xing were originally sung in the accompaniment of music, and some of them, especially temple songs, were accompanied by dancing. In all subsequent periods of Chinese literary history, new trends in poetry were profoundly influenced by music. Most of the poems in Sheng have a predominantly lyrical strain, whether the subject is hardship in military service or seasonal festivities, agriculture chores or rural scenes, love of sports, aspirations and disappointments of the common folk, and the declining aristocracy. Apparently, the language of the poems was relatively close to the daily speech of the common people, and even repeated attempts at refinement during the long process of transmission have not spoiled their freshness and spontaneity. In spite of this, however, when the songs are read aloud and not sung to music in the prevailing four-syllable lines, contour the monotony and hardly redeemed by the occasional intercession of the shorter or longer lines. If there ever was an epic tradition in the ancient China comparable to that of the early India or the West, only dim traces of it persist in the written records. The Xing has very narrative poems celebrating heroic deeds of the royal ancestors, but these are rearranged in cycles and only faintly appropriate. the national epics of other peoples. One cycle, for example, record the major stages in the rise of the Zhao kingdom, from the supernatural birth of its remote founder to the conquest of the Shang kingdom. These episodes, which according to the traditional history cover a period of more than 1,000 years and are dealt with only about 400 lines. Other cycles, which celebrate later military exploits, the royal Zhao armies, are even briefer. The Shing exerted the profound influence of the Chinese poetry that, generally speaking, has stressed the lyrical rather than the narrative element. A dependence more on the end rhymes and the music effect than on other rhetorical devices, regular lines consisting of standard number of syllables, and the utilization of annotation is inherent to the language of rhythm, instead of the alteration of stress and unstressed syllables as a norm of Western poetry. The high regard to which the anthology has been held in China results from its antiquity and from the legend of Confucius himself. It was elevated by 136 BC to the position of the major classic in Confucian Canton. Meanwhile, another type of poetry, also originating in music and dance, has been developed in the south in the basin of the Yangtze River and the area dominated by the Principality of Zhou. Hence the generic application Chuchi, songs of Chu. These southern songs, through adorned and end rhymes like usually songs of Xingyan, follow different metrical patterns. The lines are usually longer and more irregular and are commonly, through not always, marked by a strata in the middle, and their effects is thus rather plaintive and lend themselves to chanting instead of singing. The beginning of this tradition is obscure because most of the samples were eclipsed in the brilliant 4th and 3rd century BCE compositions of the towering genius Zhu Yan, China's first known poet. Among 25 elegies are attributed to Yu Yan. The most important and longest, Lao Zhao, Encountering Sorrow, which has been described as political erotic, relating by means of love allegory, the poet's disappointment with the royal master, and describing his imaginary travels in distant regions and the realms of heaven, in an attempt to rid himself of his sorrow. Yu Yan committed suicide by drowning himself in the Molo River, and his tragic death, no less than his beautiful allegories, helped him persuade a new literary genre. In contrast, the poems of the Yixing have few successful imitators, and the genre by Yu Yan was cultivated for more than 5 centuries and is still experienced later in retrievals. Thank you so much, and we'll see you next time for our next discussion on Mediterranean.